biting winds, blinding snow, and Arctic cold. The blizzard is winter at its worst.
These are extreme events. We have been horribly assaulted by nature in these snowstorms.
They prey on the isolated farmhouses of the Midwest and paralyze America's largest cities.
The outer drive is completely closed, and there are a few deserted cars there when they have snow up to the hood. So it's pretty bad here.
For those caught in the blizzard's grip, the consequences can be deadly.
By the time the people who were in the middle of the blizzard understood how serious it really was too late.
They called it the storm of the century. On March 12, 1993, it rolled across the eastern United States, spawning floods, tornadoes, and in city after city, blizzards. In Georgia, thousands were stranded in cars on Interstate 75, miles from any shelter. Birmingham, Alabama saw 13 inches of snow, more snow in one day than the city usually got in a year. In New York City, the storm was so powerful that it blew windows out of office buildings. Across a dozen states, nearly 200 people lay dead in its wake. The storm of the century was an echo of legendary blizzards from the past, storms that have plagued the American landscape and taken their toll in human life. A blizzard is not just any snowstorm.
Technically, it's defined as a snowstorm within which there are 35 mile per hour or greater winds and a visibility reduction to a quarter mile or less over at least a 3-hour sustained period. Obviously, a lot of blizzards go beyond that.
Originally, the word blizzard meant a violent blow. Pioneer settlers on the American prairies were the first to give this name to the most punishing snowstorms. Starting in the mid-19th century, the United States government gave away land to anyone willing to live on 160 desolate acres of prairie for 5 years. To those who accepted the challenge, homesteading in the West meant fighting the elements with no one to help them.
It's not a stretch to say that weather is the most daunting physiological force that people have to deal with on the Great Plains. It's something that literally has life and death implications. A drought can kill you. A tornado can kill you. A blizzard can kill you. Those are day-to-day life and death issues that you have to deal with.
To the homesteaders, no aspect of prairie weather was more feared than the blizzard.
They're surprised by the ferocity and the suddenness of these storms. It could be quite warm, above freezing one day, and then suddenly the wind will start to blow and the temperature drops by 40 degrees, and they're surprised by it and caught.
In 1888, a blizzard would become the greatest natural disaster the West had ever known. On the Great Plains, the morning of January 12, 1888, was cold but calm. Livestock grazed in the fields as farmers began their chores. The trouble started around 10:30 a.m. near the Canadian border. The wind began to blow out of the north, and what looked like a wall of fog approached. Then came a terrible roar. The temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. 56-mile-an-hour winds hurled a fine, biting snow across the fields.
You were stranded. You understood now that the snowfall was not going to be a pleasant little winter snowstorm, but that it was now blinding. and that if you were even a few hundred yards away from shelter, that you were in very, very serious trouble.
In Nebraska, the storm hit between 3 and 4 in the afternoon, just as children were getting ready to head home from their one-room schoolhouses. Across the state, young teachers, some only teenagers, suddenly faced desperate choices. Keep the children at school and hope their coal supplies held out, or send them home in the face of a horrific winter storm. In a one-room sod schoolhouse, a 19-year-old teacher named Minnie Freeman watched the storm with alarm. A Nebraska native, Minnie had seen blizzards before, but nothing like this. Though their coal supply was nearly gone, Minnie was afraid to send more than a dozen children out into such a terrible storm. She decided they would burn the desks and wait out the blizzard, but then the wind blew the door wide open. The young teacher nailed it shut. No sooner was it secure than a second, angrier gust blew it in again. Minnie grabbed a rope and quickly tied it around her waist. She used the other end to tie the children together as the roof blew off the school. The teacher and her students were forced to leave the ruined building and walk out into the blizzard. Groping blindly in the shrieking storm, Minnie found the edge of the road and led her frightened students toward the nearest shelter she knew of, her boarding house, nearly a mile away. After the wind finally died, the news from far-flung ranches and farms began to trickle in, and the scope of the disaster became clear. The storm had blasted a 1,000-mile path across the heartland, from the Canadian border to Texas. At least 235 people froze to death during the blizzard. Many more would succumb to frostbite and pneumonia in the weeks to come. Most of the victims were children and teachers. One young woman was found stretched out over 2 of her students in a vain attempt to protect them. The children died, and the teacher's frostbitten legs were amputated. But Minnie Freeman and all her students had survived the storm. The teacher quickly became a Nebraska folk heroine.
The threat to the children, compared with the heroics of Minnie Freeman, combined in a form that you would think that the Grimm brothers would have been proud of. It's almost like the older sister saving the younger siblings from the mouth of the wolf. And I think it catches the psyche in that same way, that you really were saving children from a predatory force that was evil.
Poems and even a song were written about Nebraska's fearless maid. Many received several gold watches from well-wishers and a dozen marriage proposals. To the people of the heartland, the school teacher symbolized the true pioneer spirit. Back east, however, some newspapers took a different view. They praised the teacher's courage, but saw a harsh lesson in the school children's blizzard.
The New York press was incredibly patronizing. I was particularly struck by the one newspaper that said, "If nothing else proves the folly of living in these wild regions of the West and discourages people from moving to these unsettled places, this is the event that should certainly do it."
Isn't it terrible what those people out west are suffering from? It could never happen here. And I think New Yorkers had been spoiled. They had had a series of mild winters. So it was perceived as a distant problem of other people and nothing we would ever suffer.
Gotham would soon be eating its words. Just 2 months later, New York City would be crippled by a ferocious blizzard of its own. New York City, 1888. A place where it often seemed that nature had been obliterated, replaced by a grid of streets and a forest of stone and steel.
I think it's fair to say that New York is one of the most man-made environments that the planet's ever seen. From 1811 on, they had this colossal vision of running direct grid lines north and then slicing them east and west, south, and anything in the way was, there was a mountain, they cut it down, tossed it in the nearby pond, and sort of, flattened it as much as they could. While they weren't able to quite level it down to billiard table status, they came pretty close.
Towering over the city was the Brooklyn Bridge. Just 5 years old, the bridge was the engineering triumph of the age. Elevated trains ran down 4 of the city's north-south avenues. They rained soot down on pedestrians below, but whisked commuters from Wall Street to the quiet lanes of Harlem for as little as 5 cents. To the rich, the city's clamor and chaos were beautiful. Every delivery wagon, every belching chimney, every telegraph wire meant that someone somewhere was making money. In the crowded slums of the Lower East Side, New York's mastery of nature meant dark, overcrowded streets, a far cry from the golden land promised by the 2-year-old Statue of Liberty.
When you talk about technology, a city in and of itself is a technology. It's a way of allowing more people to live per square mile than nature would normally allow. And so the perception very quickly rises that your technology allows you to dominate nature.
In reality, the people of Manhattan, rich and poor, were much more vulnerable to nature than anyone realized. All transit and all communications were carried above ground, with no protection from the elements. A major storm could deprive 1.5 million people of food, fuel, and contact with the outside world. On the morning of Sunday, March 11th, 1888, snow was the farthest thing from any New Yorker's mind. Spring was just around the corner. People were talking about the upcoming baseball season. The Giants were favorites to win the pennant. And about Barnum and Bailey's Circus, scheduled to open on Monday at Madison Square Garden.
The New York Herald that day ran an ode to spring called The First Dandelion by their resident poet Walt Whitman. Right alongside of that poem, they ran an article in which they were amused by the fact that a merchant down on Grand Street in Manhattan the previous day had gotten a shipment of 1,200 snow shovels.
Rain was forecast for that afternoon and for the next few days, but nothing more severe than that. The rain did come and became a downpour by evening. The city had no way of knowing what would come next. The Manhattan office of the Weather Bureau was closed, as it always was, between Saturday and Sunday nights. While the city slept, an intensely powerful winter storm rolled north along the Atlantic coast and stalled off the New Jersey shore. That night, it battered ships, but with no wireless telegraphs, they could not warn coastal cities of the storm's arrival. New Yorkers awoke on the morning of March 12th to a landscape transformed. Drifts covered the stoops of brownstones and tenements alike. 10 inches of snow were on the ground, and more was coming down.
You see maybe some shadows of telegraph poles or the wires brought down by ice in most cases. You see a blank whiteness that many people realized resembled the earlier blizzard of 1888.
With no weather reports to guide them, most assumed that this was just a heavy snowstorm and headed out into the streets. Blizzard or no blizzard, people had to get to work. Jobs were hard to come by, and many workers got paid by the amount they produced.
You needed to work all those hours, given the abysmally low rate that you got paid for each little shirt, in order to sort of keep body and soul together. There's a tremendous competitive pressure, and if you don't keep up to the mark, you're history.
The choice is to stay put and possibly lose a job, but hope that it is so bad that maybe the boss didn't get in either, in which case they wouldn't know, or to venture out and just do their very best to get where they're supposed to be going.
The blizzard played a cruel trick on Manhattan. Between 7 and 9 that morning, the time of day when the most people were out in the streets, the storm worsened. All the city's transit systems shut down under the storm's assault. First to go were horse-drawn carriages and streetcars. Some drivers unhitched their nags and rode them home, leaving passengers stranded. Snow and ice choked the elevated railroads, and by 10 a.m., at least 15,000 people were trapped in L cars, stranded more than 30 feet above the street.
And New York entrepreneurs, being what they are, would come out with their ladders and charge 50 cents or $1 to get people down off the elevated.
Among the New Yorkers struggling through the drifts that morning was a young historian named Theodore Roosevelt. He had an appointment at the New York Historical Society at their offices on 11th Street. Never one to let nature stand in his way, Roosevelt made the 3-mile trek on foot, only to be disappointed.
Charles Isham, the secretary of the Historical Society, did not show up. He had stayed home. Teddy Roosevelt was furious and later wrote a very nasty letter to Mr. Isham saying that he had basically been a dereliction of duty not to come out in this weather.
Not everyone was as tough as Teddy Roosevelt. Across the city, small dramas played themselves out as individuals struggled to cope with the raging storm.
The storm became the great leveler of the classes in the city. You had bankers and shopgirls and beggars finding shelter together. The winds were so great that people were crawling on their hands and knees trying to get to shelter.
And I think people didn't have any sense of how altering the landscape of Manhattan would also perhaps exacerbate and make worse the storms. That is, when the winds come down those high canyons.
Buildings of every kind were filled with people who had tried to get to work but were now stranded. The blizzard was worsening, and there was no way for them to get home except on foot.
So not only were the pedestrians, and everyone had been reduced to pedestrian by that point, dealing with the wind, the snow, and the cold, but there were also objects falling from above, signs and awnings and overhangs from buildings, and the utility wires. And there were electrical wires snapping blue flames around the streets.
People walking home were pelted by frozen sparrows, falling by the dozens from their perches on the rooftops above. A few pedestrians, pushing through drifts, stumbled on the frozen corpses of fellow commuters. As dusk approached, Manhattan was completely cut off from the outside world. One by one, the blizzard had knocked out every piece of modern technology that had made a city like New York possible. And the snow kept coming down. On the morning of March 13th, 1888, New York City was shut down. The blizzard that had ravaged the city the day before tapered away late that morning. As the winds died down, 20 inches of snow covered the city. Manhattan was silent, white, beautiful, and locked in the grip of an icy blockade. Across the city, people were stranded away from home in ferry stations, office buildings, and hotel lobbies. Mark Twain, in town for a banquet, was outraged at this imposition on his schedule. He wrote his wife back home in Connecticut. Here I have been cruising on a desert hotel, out of wife, out of children, out of line, and out of cigars, out of every blamed thing in the world I've any use for. Few people in New York had the luxury of worrying about cigars that morning. The city had weathered the storm, but with telegraph lines down and railroads snowed in, its lifelines had been severed. To all appearances, the city teetered on the brink of chaos. There was food in the warehouses of Manhattan, but there was no way to get it to stores or homes. And few New Yorkers had stored provisions.
And this is because the city had become used to having daily deliveries. You didn't have to go to the market. You got milk delivered, you got your bread delivered, you got your newspapers delivered to your door. But suddenly they were deprived, and so the outrage was even greater.
If the rich were inconvenienced, the poor were in grave danger that day. Merchants who had food in stock quickly doubled their prices. For people making $3 a week, even a nickel's increase in price was beyond their means. Some desperate housewives gathered frozen sparrows and cooked them into pies for dinner that night. Milk was in the greatest demand. The price now soared to 75 cents a glass. In hotel bars, men who hadn't touched this stuff in years ordered milk, just to show that they could afford it. Fuel was another problem. Tenement families bought their coal supply a day at a time. Most had no fuel left, and temperatures were hovering around 10 degrees. The only way New York would avoid a complete breakdown would be to dig out, and fast, and it would have to do it by hand. The city hired thousands of workers, mostly recent Italian immigrants, at the unprecedented wage of $1.50 a day.
They tripled the wages for these men. So they were able to get not only their regular crew of casual laborers, but they brought all their friends and relatives to join in the shoveling process.
I believe the figure is below 42nd Street. They carted off 1 million cartloads of snow and dumped it in the river. The one advantage Manhattan has is that it's surrounded by rivers. If you can get the snow off the street, you have a place to get rid of it.
When communication was finally reestablished with the rest of the country late on Tuesday afternoon, New Yorkers learned to their shock that their city hadn't seen the worst of the storm. The entire Northeast had been pummeled. Manhattan had gotten 20 inches of snow, but Connecticut had seen 50. Some parts of upstate New York got 5 feet. In small towns, people were used to the hardships imposed by winter weather. They stayed home, lived off stored provisions, and waited. New Yorkers, on the other hand, had behaved as if their city were impervious to nature's power and paid the price. Of the 400 people killed in the storm, 200 of them lived in New York City. In the weeks that followed, the storm became fodder for newspaper editorials, pondering the question, what has the blizzard taught us?
Some of the papers took a rather humble view of what had happened. They said, we think of ourselves as the Empire City, the seat of civilization. We think that our technology has made us invulnerable and immune to God's universe, essentially. But we now know this is not the case. And let us go forward, with hope for the future, but aware of the fact that we are still God's children and that nature is the strongest force in the world.
It's a chastening reminder. It humbles the city, but of course it's not going to stop the project. The project is, in fact, if anything, going to pick up more steam as it moves into the electrified future.
This future would be shaped by the blizzard's aftermath. Laws banning above-ground telegraph wires were finally enforced. A long dreamed of subway system also got a boost from the snowstorm. The New York Times thundered, "It is intolerable that the internal transit of New York should be at the mercy of the elements." Big city politics and technical challenges would hold the subway back a few more years. The first branch wouldn't open until 1904. But after the blizzard, no one doubted that the city needed to put its transport underground. New York would be hit by blizzards again, but never faced the paralysis that gripped the city in March 1888. For most of the 20th century, Chicago, the so-called Second City, would face winter's wrath every year and pride itself on not letting a blizzard get in its way. But in 1967, a sudden 23-inch snowstorm, known ever after as the Big Snow, would knock Chicago for a loop. In Chicago, a beautiful January day is about as rare as a Republican mayor. January 24th, 1967, was one of those rare days. 60-degree temperatures gave the city a brief respite from a typically frigid winter.
I think it's part of the daily routine in winter around here that you realize somewhere in the back of your head that one of these big storms may in fact be lurking off in the distance and upon you before you know it.
The next day, temperatures dropped, and the forecast for Thursday, January 26th, promised a return to normal winter weather.
A mystery. WCFL weather, cloudy today with a chance of snow tonight, possibly 1 to 2 inches by tomorrow morning.
In the early morning hours of January 26th, the forecast was changed, 4 inches of snow. By the time the morning rush hour started, the snow was coming down fast, and the forecasts were changing.
The forecast has been revised now. We expect around 15 inches of snow, and I hope there's no more.
I headed down to the loop in my car and had the radio on and listened as I was coming down, and sort of indicated that it was heavier than it had been forecast. Nobody, of course, at that point anticipated 23 inches.
But 23 inches is what the city got. Falling as fast as 1 inch every hour, the snow caught the city completely off guard. 50-mile-an-hour gusts created whiteout conditions on the roads.
For suburbanites as well as city residents, the word is don't travel unless it's an absolute emergency. The outer drive is completely closed, and there are a few deserted cars there, and they have snow up to the hood. So it's pretty bad here.
The snow finally stopped coming down just after 10 a.m. on January 27th, more than 29 hours after it began. 50,000 cars and 800 buses were abandoned on the city streets. The only way to survey Chicago's plight was from the air.
I flew over Chicago, and it was twice as bad as I expected. I mean, I had get reports all night long from ward superintendents, but nothing was moving. It was a shock.
Attempts to clear the roads were hindered by a catch-22 situation. No cars could be moved until plows got through, but no plows could get through all the cars.
Imagine the problems in cleaning snow on a workday in a major urban area, but then complicated by putting thousands of vehicles out there that folks simply just abandoned because they couldn't go any farther, even on the big highways and thoroughfares.
They would go in and try to plow and find out that they had a Volkswagen underneath it. It was unbelievable. They actually did plow right over cars and take off bumpers, trying to get them out with the heavy snow.
I remember seeing people walking down the Dan Ryan because their cars were just stuck in a huge train of stopped cars. You could walk the Dan Ryan for 2 miles.
Some took advantage of the city's paralysis. Stores and stranded trucks became targets for looters.
The looting occurred on the west side predominantly. A 10-year-old girl, Dolores Miller, was shot to death as police exchanged gunfire with some looters in a shoe store on West Roosevelt Road.
More than 200 looters, including one Chicago cop, were arrested in the days after the storm. Across the city, thousands were trapped in schools, firehouses, and factories where they had taken refuge during the night. Any food or medicine would have to come in from the air. Nearly every helicopter in the city was pressed into service. At one South Side firehouse, choppers were dispatched to remove the body of a man who had died there during the night.
When he passed away, they just put him out in the snow is what they did. So we responded when we had the extra time and sat him up in the helicopter and tied him in, and off he went. We flew the body out to Midway Airport, awaiting hers. And when the pilot came back, he said the passenger didn't mind the ride at all.
As the digging out process went on, Chicago's notorious politics came into play. Neighborhoods with powerful aldermen expected their streets to be cleaned sooner.
That was always a problem. If a ward superintendent would ask for trucks to be sent to, as an example, maybe the Tom Keene's ward over on the west side, or somebody else's ward, they went there. If they were sent to a ward that perhaps wasn't as influential, they got waylaid on the way and got over to a different ward. We were constantly fighting that battle.
Chicagoans pride themselves on not letting winter get them down. As the immediate danger passed, what had been a life-threatening disaster became something of a holiday. Schools were closed, workers took days off, and neighbors pitched in to help one another out.
This whole thing was dumped on us so quickly and in some ways so beautifully that there was almost a surreal quality. And there was an almost festive quality if you were not directly doing something miserable like trying to dig your car out.
One person who emerged unscathed from the storm was the city's three-term mayor and political boss, Richard J. Daley. A master politician, Daley made sure to stress that the city had done everything it could and that people needed to pitch in themselves.
Of course, with a storm of this magnitude, it's going to take some time. Again, we ask all the people for their cooperation and their help and their assistance.
I think the mayor was smart enough to say, this is a natural disaster and we're going to have to live through it and let's be calm. So they were.
2 months after the blizzard, Daley was re-elected in a landslide to a fourth term. The city's handling of the snow wasn't even an issue in the campaign. 12 years later, winter would not be so kind to Chicago's political machine.
Take it up with the commissioner.
Chicago's 1967 blizzard was the worst single snowstorm ever to hit the city. 12 years later, however, the city would be battered by a month-long winter siege. The story of the 1979 blizzards would eventually become the story of a political dynasty's downfall. January 1979. For 3 consecutive winters, Chicago had been in the grip of unprecedented Arctic cold.
An analysis of those mid and late 70s winters indicates that collectively they were the worst winters we've ever seen in, for instance, the Chicago and Milwaukee areas. And that's dating back into the late 1800s. Extreme cold. Oh, we had 90-degree below zero wind chills on occasion.
Now, as 1979 began, Chicago was hit with its biggest onslaught yet. A 9-inch snowstorm buried the city on New Year's Eve. Over the next 2 weeks, below zero temperatures kept city crews from being able to dig Chicago out. It didn't help that the city's government wasn't the well-oiled machine that it had been under Mayor Daley.
I think the machine was starting to disintegrate by this stage. If you recall, Mayor Daley died in December of 1976. He had an iron hand on how things went. So we had an interim period there of over 2 years where you were not leaderless, but you didn't have a strong leader like Richard Daley.
Daley's successor, Michael Bilandic, was a longtime Democratic loyalist. But Daley's image loomed over the city and over Mayor Bilandic.
Michael Bilandic was a man who was not really a public man. He was a manager. He was a very intelligent man, a very thoughtful man, but he did not know how to handle the very public, open role of being a mayor.
Bilandic was facing a challenge in the upcoming primary election from Jane Byrne, also a longtime Democratic loyalist. But her chances of beating a machine-backed incumbent mayor were slim at best.
Snowball's chance in hell, to be very blunt. I think she was a real underdog.
But winter began to work for Jane Byrne. Chicago, still reeling from the New Year's Eve storm, was hit with another crippling 19-inch snowfall on January 12th. Sub-zero temperatures followed in its wake. The city's already troubled attempts to get streets cleared and trains running now collapsed. Streets weren't plowed. Commuters waited on windy L platforms in sub-zero weather for trains that never came. Even by Chicago standards, this was a miserable winter. But it was the city government's failure to deal with the snow that turned annoyance into anger.
I remember standing on Lawrence Avenue one night, bitterly cold. The snowplows were out there trying to remove from the crowd. Residents were upset. You could see they're angry. Well, you finally come, they're hollering at the city streets in Santa Cruz. You're finally here. What took so long? You could see there was rebellion in the air.
There was snow after snow, freeze after freeze, going through this ice, people frustrated, angry. They were probably angry at their own households, and no way to vent this except they finally did politically.
I think they could do a better job if Mayor Daley was still alive. A lot better.
I think they should leave the snow on the ground and distribute toboggans.
The city's rage at the snow was epitomized by the bizarre story of a frustrated snowplow driver. 2 weeks after the January 12th blizzard, at the end of an 18-hour shift, the driver went on a rampage. He drove his plow into 34 cars, leaving 1 man dead and 5 injured. He told arresting officers, "I hate my job. I want to see my kids." Chicago's murder rate was 69% higher that month than it had been a year before. Every attempt by the city to solve its problems seemed to backfire.
What Mike Bilandic's administration failed to do was to remind Chicagoans that a lot of this effort would depend upon them making a contribution as well. Don't just sit back and wait for the city to come to the rescue. Grab a shovel. Bilandic didn't do that.
To get streets clear for plows, Bilandic told Chicagoans to move their cars to city parking lots. But those lots turned out to be under 3 feet of snow. To get the L running more efficiently, the Transit Authority authorized trains to skip stops.
And so the stops that they skipped were the stops in the heart of the black community. And so here are black workers, middle class, lower class, upper class, whatever, waiting, and the trains are going by them. What in the world is going on?
They're waiting, and they'd see the train go by and wouldn't stop for them. How would you feel? Angry would put it mildly.
A year before, the city had paid $90,000 to a consulting firm for an updated snow emergency plan. But the so-called consultant turned out to be a machine insider, and his report was nowhere to be found.
And they finally said, "Oh, there's been a report, here it is." But I remember that the night the snow report got put into my hands, the paper still felt warm because it had just come off the copy machines. It was a report literally thrown together that never existed when the blizzard occurred.
Heads rolled at City Hall. Mayor Bilandic appointed a new director of the Snow Command, and a week later, the Chicago Tribune reported that he was connected to the mafia. As columnist Mike Royko put it, in no other city would a record snowfall eventually be revealed to have a crime syndicate connection. All these political missteps became fodder for the mayoral campaign of Jane Byrne.
No one could stop the snow, but good planning can prevent the collapse of public transportation and clean this city up fast. I'm Jane Byrne, Commissioner of Consumer Sales under the late Mayor Daley. Nothing seems to be working the way it used to. I think it's time to get Chicago working again for you.
Vote for Jane Byrne in the Democratic primary.
2 months earlier, Jane Byrne had been an underdog without a chance. On February 10th, Byrne beat Bilandic in the primary, the first person to defeat the Chicago machine candidate for mayor in more than 60 years. In Chicago, the winner of the Democratic primary always won the general election, and in April, Byrne took office with 82% of the vote. The lesson of the 1979 blizzard was not lost on Byrne's successors.
People in this city expect this from city government. When this white stuff begins to fall, get the plows out, get the salt trucks out, a massive approach, a massive attack is needed. If not, I'm going to vote you out of office.
In January 1999, Chicago was socked by a blizzard even greater than the 1979 storm. Mayor Richard M. Daley, whose father had been mayor during the 1967 storm, made snow removal a priority. Daley made sure not to make too many promises.
I'm calling upon all Chicagoans to pitch in and help each other and help their neighbors, especially.
2 months after the blizzard, Daley was re-elected in a landslide, just as his father had been after the 1967 storm.
We expect an awful lot from our governments. We expect no interruption in our normal daily routine thanks to the most abhorrent forms of weather. The fact is, these are extreme events. The rarity of their occurrence underscores that. And the fact is, we've got to understand that we have been horribly assaulted by nature in these snowstorms.
In the days of the prairie homesteaders, anyone caught in a blizzard had only one concern: survival. Advances in meteorology seem to have turned blizzards from killers into inconveniences. But the lesson of history's great blizzards is clear. No precautions can stop the force of these winter storms, and to ignore their power is to invite disaster.